Hey, thanks for checking out this week's video. I'm covering part 2 of this piece, which is finally the painting process. Now, it's quite a long video, mostly because I didn't want to cut out too much of the footage. I just think there's nothing worse than when a time-lapse skips the parts that you really want to see. And also it's kind of sped up as much as possible without it making you go cross-eyed. Now, I have to say this is probably the most time and effort I've ever put into a gouache painting to date. I'd actually lost track of how many hours I'd put in, but since I'm recording it, I could figure it out, and it turns out that the undersketch and the painting combined took over 10 hours in total. Just for anyone that wanted to know, I don't think there's always that much transparency about how long paintings can take. And I certainly learned a lot doing this than I have in past paintings, so I thought I'd try and share as much of that as possible with you guys. So just to bring us up to speed, I'm using gouache paint on hot press watercolor paper, which just means it's a smooth texture that was mounted, or in other words just glued, to an A4 size wooden panel. The undersketch was covered in part 1 of the video, so I'll link that below, and also if you want the exact names and links to all the materials that I use, they will also be in the description box below. Now, as always, the undersketch is fixed using a workable fixative for drawings and pastels, and I usually give it 2 coats with about 15 minutes or so worth of drying time in between. This just stops the graphite from smudging and muddying up any colours when I start painting. And if you're new to my channel, you're probably wondering why I'm using gouache so watered down, because it's practically watercolour now, right? Personally, I just find that when I build up gradual layers, I get a really nice smooth finish. And also when the paint's thin, it's still fairly easy to go over and over again without lifting too much of that colour underneath, which if you're familiar with gouache is really easy to do, especially when it's thick. It's a great feature, but sometimes it's not what you want. So doing it this way I feel is quite non-committal, because I've still got quite a lot of room to fix errors that can be harder to work with when it's all built up and really thick. And I actually did have an issue with this, which took some working out, so I'll discuss that later on in the video. So about the painting, so far I have just blocked in all the basic colours. As you can see to the left, I've got my colour test that I did a video on a few weeks back, so I've got quite a good idea of where I'm going with it. I knew the background was going to be dark and that would take a few layers to get that effect, so I'm just sort of hopping around the painting, allowing areas to dry fully before I return to do a second layer. This method requires a bit of patience, or a hairdryer I guess, because painting on an area that isn't fully dry will ruin your previous layer. The best way I found to tell whether or not it's dry enough for a second layer, or third or fourth, wherever you're at, is that it not only needs to be dry to the touch, but if it feels cold when you touch it, then it isn't fully dry. So basically if you touch it and it feels dry, but the paper's colder than other areas, then it's not ready. You might be able to get away with it, but personally I don't risk it. Okay, so I just want to talk about what's happening in this close-up shot that's coming up, because it's the painting technique that I use the most and it helps me achieve that really smooth finish. Basically, I've started by wetting the area with clean water so the paper's damp. It's not got a puddle on it, it's not completely loaded with water, it doesn't run along the paper if I tip it up, but it's got a nice shine everywhere. Then I load my brush with paint, not so it's dripping, but there's a good amount on it. If you do start painting and you realise there's too much on your brush, you can just touch the very tip of the brush hairs to either like a kitchen towel or a rag that you're using, and it will draw some of that paint out and you can just go back to your painting. You can see I've put quite a strong colour down where the darkest area would be, and that's intentional because it's not all going to stay that way. Once it's in the right place, I clean my brush and then I get rid of most of the water, but the brush is still damp, so it's not making texture marks on the paper, but it's not so wet that I'm adding water to the paper, because that would push the paint away and ruin the effect. Then I'm taking that brush and lightly blending out the edge by brushing back into the darker area. The great thing about this technique is that because you're working wet on wet, that you have quite a bit of flexibility with it, so if you do end up putting too much paint down and you need to lift some off, you do have time, you don't have to completely rush, you can go slower. I feel like this is perhaps the time where I can go the slowest. It does take a bit of practice to know how much water to have on the paper, how much paint to have on your brush, and how much water not to have on your brush, which I can only recommend learning by doing, to be honest. But once you've got that down, you've got a feel for that, it's really easy. And even when you're learning, like I say, it's so flexible, you can fix mistakes. So from here I'm just building those layers, which is why I'll hop around a lot rather than just focusing on one area until it's complete. I think the most annoying characteristic of gouache is that it never dries the same colour as when you put it down. Darker colours dry lighter and lighter colours dry darker. It really is a guessing game sometimes, but also makes for some nice happy accidents, which sadly you probably can't replicate again just due to the nature of it. I haven't really found a great way to combat this yet, because doing swatches I don't think would really help that much. You don't know what the paint looked like when it was wet because the swatch would have dried differently. I guess unless you swatched it right from the tube and maybe made rough notes of percentages in relation to the ratios you mixed them, but for me I don't think it'd be all that reliable. I guess this is another reason why I prefer to gradually work up to the values and saturations by using it thin and doing the work within those layers. That way I can judge it a bit better each time it dries. You'll see me battling with it. I mean, I think the hardest part is always the highlights, getting that true white or almost true white. I think the worst part for me was the pumpkin, because I was putting down this paint. It had like a bluish tint to the light and it looked perfect when I put it down, and then I'd work on something else and I'd look at it and I'd be like, hey, what happened to, where'd it go? It just completely disappeared when it dried. So yeah, it can be frustrating. One thing I did try to make a conscious effort with during this painting was that I really just wanted to use paint, just to focus on painting alone, because I always use coloured pencils with my gouache, and I did in this piece, but I told myself that I wanted to try get the results that I had in mind with using paint alone, and then I could use, for the finishing touches, some pencil here and there. And I definitely feel like I made progress. There were a few errors here and there that I normally would have relied on pencils for tidying up, but I managed to fix it with a paint, and it was so much more satisfying to know that I didn't need to rely on those pencils. Although I did notice that my smallest brush, which is that Escoda Perla that I showed in that art haul not too long ago, it's a great brush and I love it, but it's still not small enough for the smallest areas. So for Christmas I've put it on my wish list to get an even smaller one. So you see in this close-up I'm working on the hair. Pay attention to how the paint flows and moves. Now I haven't mentioned yet in the video, but you can probably see on the right hand side of the overhead shot I've got 2 cups of water. One of them is as clean as it can be while using it, and the other one's really dirty. You know, the clean one has ox gall in it, and the other one is just for cleaning out the majority of the paint. So I've always got a bit of clean water when I need it. Now the ox gall, if you haven't heard of it, I did do a quick overview of it on the art haul video. Again, I'll put this in the description box below in case you want to check it out. Basically, it is a watercolor medium that is supposed to help increase the flow of the paint, but I use it in gouache because it's practically the same thing, right? And in this close-up, I felt like you could actually see it working. I mean, I'm using quite a lot of paint and probably more water than paint, let's be honest, but you can see it seems to spread more on the paper, whereas when I'm not using this it doesn't seem to move too much by itself. Like, I have to do a lot more work with the brush. When I first tested out the ox gall, I wasn't that sure. I kind of felt like I saw it but didn't at the same time. But no, I definitely, from doing this piece, I definitely feel a difference, and I don't think I'll be without it. Plus, not only that, but you only have to use, like, literally the instructions are 3 to 4 drops per cup. So it's gonna last a long time. Just a quick note about the, I guess, color theory and color design of this piece. She has a blue background and then yellow clothing, and one thing I always like to do is to reflect some of that background into the clothing and hair and things like that, because I just feel like it really ties the piece in together. However, as you know, mixing blue and yellow makes green, and that was the last thing I really wanted. So that was really important, to sort of wait for those layers to dry as much as possible and then to really saturate it more than I normally would, just so I didn't get that green as much. I think I had the most fun painting this pumpkin out of everything in this painting because I was able to use such saturated colours. It's a really easy shape to work with as well, but there's some detail, you know, you've got the ridges and things. And like I was just saying before, I like to add the background colours and things to tie it all in, so I put some blue reflections and shadows in it, and it was just really fun to play with, as well as that like drippy thing I do underneath. I don't really know what it is, but it was a happy accident in one of the colour tests and I just wanted to keep it. But yeah, just watch those blue highlights from when they're wet to when they're dry. The difference is huge. It drove me crazy. So it's around here that I start to use the Escoda Perla brush, and I think this is the most I've really used it at this point. And it was really fun because I'd obviously already got this design sort of sketched on there, so I had a good guide. I did try to keep the panel just one direction because I know it kind of sucks when you're watching someone do a time lapse and the canvas or whatever it is they're drawing on is spinning around doing somersaults, and like almost makes you feel travel sick somehow. But there was a particular area, because I worked from right to left instead of left to right, and I'm right-handed, it meant that I would have put my hand in wet paint, so I had no choice but to turn it. I really didn't want to work on a different area and then come back to it, so sorry about that. So just here you see me working on the third layer of the background. And before I forget to say it, I do use some iridescent medium and I sort of dot it on. I was trying to mimic sort of like a starry night or something perhaps, but it didn't come out as nice as I wanted. So I ended up re-wetting it, and that helped to lift up the iridescent medium just like any sort of paint pigment, and I could redistribute it. So the end result has got a really nice shimmer to it. With the background itself, because it was the third layer and it did already have some darker pigment on it beforehand, it was starting to lift really easily. So you can see in the close-up that I'm doing a lot more just sort of dabbing and really using a lot of paint and a lot of sort of water, just really trying to load it up to get it to stick. And it did work, but I was worried about the paper perhaps buckling. I mean, I know it's glued to an A4 panel and I had heavy books and things sitting on it for over 24 hours, but it's still a possibility, right? And it did turn out that it really is a possibility. There was a small little area next to her hair that a little bubble appeared, and oh my goodness, I started panicking. I thought I had ruined it completely, but thankfully I just stopped working on it completely. I just let it dry and I left it alone, and it fixed itself. It went back flat afterwards, but that made me so anxious for other areas doing that, but luckily it never happened again, and I just tried to be a bit more cautious, particularly in that area where it did happen. So earlier in the video I had mentioned that I particularly struggled with an area of layering where the paint had become much thicker and I had a hard time basically. It's kind of an understatement. It was on her forehead, basically where it sort of goes a bit grayer. Part of the layering that I do is that I'll cover the entire face or whatever area it is that I'm working on with the same colour thinly to make it all a uniform sort of tone, if that makes sense. There is a term for it, it's called glazing, and they use it in many other painting mediums like oils and acrylics and things. And this particular part, I just wanted to cover her forehead. So I had wet the areas around it, like I always do, and then I started to add the paint. And then I moved on to another area, and I noticed as the forehead had started to dry, I got these terrible water lines just under the middle of her forehead, basically. And it was awful. I couldn't make a new layer on top of it because it would have made it even worse. I couldn't work with what was already there unless I had maybe got like a bit of kitchen towel and dabbed the whole thing, but that may have brought up paint from previous layers, which would have made it even worse. So in the end, what I decided to do, and I'd gone out on a complete limb, and the only reason I had done this was because I did a similar technique for the hair. Because the hair was so dark, it was lifting really easy with extra layers. So I kind of did it with the background too. I dabbed on a very watery mixture that was as pigmented as I could get it. And I just, basically I pre-wet where I didn't want it, leading up to where I did want it, if that makes sense. Then I put this very large amount of water and pigment mixture where I did want it, but because I'd softened that edge with the water, it sort of bled gently by itself without me having to use the brush on the surface, because that's what it is, it's the brush being on the surface that sort of takes off that layer of pigment underneath. So I did the same technique on her forehead, and thank goodness it worked. So other than that problem that I encountered and the constant battle of the highlight, I think those were the only areas I really struggled with, which I don't think was too bad. Overall, I really enjoyed doing this piece, and I do think it's one of my better pieces. You can see me here, I'm just finishing off with pencils now, and this is a great way just to get those fine details that I can't get with a brush. But hopefully I'll buy a smaller brush and maybe I can get those details, we'll see. What I also like about the pencils is not just being able to outline and get those kind of details, but I can do very gentle shading and blend it a bit with a paper stump. And it can add very subtle hue changes that I can't get quite so easily with paint, not unless I want to have another one of those fiascos that I just explained. And that about wraps it up. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions, do feel free to ask below. If you like the video, do give it a like, and if you want to see more, then hit that subscribe button. Until next time, bye!